My parents lost my baby in the amusement park because my sister's baby wanted a sweet. They just left her waiting so my baby wouldn't want one too. My 4-year-old daughter was found crying alone near the amusement park's Ferris wheel, abandoned by my parents for over 3 hours. A worker called me at 7:32 p.m., saying she'd been wandering, scared, with no one watching her. My parents had ditched her there and gone home. I called my mom, hand shaking, asking why they left my kid behind. She said they forgot her, like it was nothing, and told me to calm down. Forgot her. My baby, lost in a crowded park, while they didn't even notice she was gone. I raced to get her, my mind reeling from the call. Later, I found out they'd left her on purpose. My sister's kid wanted cotton candy, and they didn't want mine asking for some too. So they took my niece to get it, left my daughter standing alone, and walked away. They didn't check on her, didn't call me, just drove off like she didn't exist. The park worker had to step in because my own family couldn't be bothered. My daughter spent hours terrified, surrounded by strangers, all because my niece's whining mattered more. My parents didn't even care enough to tell me she was missing. They acted like losing my kid was a minor inconvenience. That was when it sank in. My family didn't just favor my sister's child, they tossed mine aside without a second thought. I picked her up, still crying, from the park office, and the worker said she'd been screaming for me the whole time. 3 hours lost, all because my parents picked my niece over my daughter. My sister has always been the golden child in our family, and I've lived in her shadow since we were kids. Our parents treated her like she could do no wrong, while I got the leftovers of their attention. She was the one they bragged about at family gatherings, the one they helped with homework, the one they took on special trips. I was just there, expected to figure things out on my own. When we grew up, nothing changed. She got married first, had kids first, and suddenly her life became their whole world. My daughter was born 2 years after my sister's first kid, but you'd think mine didn't exist half the time. My parents would drop everything for my sister's children, babysitting, buying them toys, showing up to every little event. My daughter got a pat on the head if she was lucky. They'd call my niece and nephew their little stars, while my kid barely got a mention. It wasn't just small stuff either. When my sister needed money for a new car, they handed it over without blinking. When I asked for help with daycare costs, they said I should manage better. My sister could call them crying about anything, and they'd rush to fix it. I'd call with a problem, and they'd tell me to toughen up. It's been this way forever. Her needs trumped mine, and now her kids trump mine. I thought I was used to it, but I didn't realize how far it went until that day at the amusement park. That's when I saw they didn't just prefer her family, they'd sacrifice mine to keep hers happy. Last Saturday, my parents offered to take my daughter and my sister's daughter to the amusement park for the afternoon. I was hesitant because I knew how they favored my niece, but my daughter begged to go, and I didn't want to disappoint her. She's 4, loves rides, and rarely gets time with her grandparents since they're always busy with my sister's kids. I figured it'd be a rare chance for her to feel special too. My sister dropped off her 5-year-old daughter at my parents' house, and they picked up mine an hour later. They drove both girls to the park, promising a fun day out. Things seemed fine at first. My mom sent me a photo of them on the carousel, both kids smiling. I relaxed a little, thinking maybe I'd misjudged how bad the favoritism was. But then it happened. Around 4 p.m., my niece started whining for cotton candy. She's got a sweet tooth and throws fits if she doesn't get her way. My parents didn't want to deal with her tantrum, but they also didn't want my daughter asking for some too. They hate spending extra money on my kid, always have. So instead of saying no to my niece or buying for both, they came up with a plan. They told my daughter to wait by the bench near the tilt-a-whirl, said they'd be right back, and took my niece off to find a cotton candy stand. My daughter, trusting them, stood there alone. They didn't plan to return soon. They just wanted my niece happy, and my kid out of the way. That's when everything went wrong. My daughter stood by that bench near the tilt-a-whirl, waiting for her grandparents to come back with my niece. She's only 4, small for her age, and doesn't know how to find help in a crowded place like an amusement park. My parents walked off with my niece, found a cotton candy stand halfway across the park, and bought her a big pink swirl. They didn't hurry back. My niece ate her treat, sticky hands and all, while they watched her like she was the only kid there. My daughter stayed put at first, probably scared but trusting they'd return like they promised. Minutes turned into an hour. The park was packed, families, teenagers, noise everywhere, and she started wandering, looking for them. She didn't know where to go, just kept moving, getting farther from the bench. My parents didn't notice. After my niece finished her cotton candy, they decided to hit one more ride, the teacups, because she begged for it. They didn't check on my daughter, didn't even think about her standing alone. By 5:30 p.m., they were done, loaded my niece into the car, and drove home. They forgot my kid existed. At 7:32 p.m., my phone rang. A park worker had found my daughter near the Ferris wheel, crying, covered in dirt from tripping somewhere. She'd been lost for over 3 hours. The worker stayed late, trying to track down her family, and finally called me from the office phone. I was shaking, asking how this happened. She said my parents left her behind. I called them right after. My mom answered, sounding annoyed, saying they forgot her at the park and I shouldn't make a fuss. My dad grabbed the phone, claiming they assumed she'd wandered off and someone would find her. They didn't care. They were home, watching TV, while my kid was alone and terrified. I drove to the amusement park in a panic, breaking every speed limit to get my daughter. She was in the office when I arrived, sitting on a plastic chair, her face streaked with tears and dirt. The park worker, a woman named Lisa, handed her over, explaining she'd found her near the Ferris wheel after hearing her cry for over an hour. My daughter clung to me, shaking, and wouldn't let go. Lisa said she'd searched for my parents herself, walking the park for 2 hours, asking vendors and security if they'd seen them. No one had. My parents hadn't even reported her missing. I thanked Lisa, took my daughter home, and put her to bed after a bath. She fell asleep fast, exhausted from the ordeal. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying my mom's casual tone, how they forgot her and didn't care. The next morning, I called my sister to see if she knew anything. She said my parents had dropped her daughter off at 6 p.m., acting normal, never mentioning mine was missing. Then she let slip they'd stopped for ice cream on the way. My niece wanted more treats, so they indulged her again. My daughter was still lost then, but they didn't bother turning back. I dug deeper and called the park again. Lisa answered, saying she'd stayed late to help because she'd lost a kid once too, her own, years ago, in a different park. It wasn't on purpose, but it made her obsessive about finding mine. She'd even checked security cameras, spotting my parents leaving with my niece at 5:45 p.m., laughing, no sign of worry. That hit hard. They weren't just careless. They enjoyed their day while my kid suffered. I realized this wasn't a one-off. They'd always put my sister's family first, but now they'd crossed a line I couldn't ignore. After putting my daughter to bed that night, I sat in the dark, thinking about how my parents left her behind. It wasn't just the amusement park incident that gnawed at me, it was a pattern I'd ignored too long. My sister's kids always got the best of them, while mine got scraps or nothing. I remembered a time 2 years ago when my daughter was 2 and my niece was 3. My parents had taken them to a playground. My niece fell off a slide and scraped her knee, so they rushed her to their house to clean it up, leaving my daughter alone on the swings. A neighbor found her an hour later, sitting there, waiting. They didn't call me then either, just said she was fine when I picked her up. I brushed it off as a mistake, but now it looked deliberate. They'd done this before and gotten away with it. The amusement park was worse, though. 3 hours lost, no attempt to find her, and they drove off with my niece like it was a normal day. I called my dad the next morning, asking why they didn't care. He got defensive, saying my sister's kid needed them more because she's sensitive. My daughter's tougher, he claimed, so she could handle being left. That excuse didn't hold up. She's 4, not some survival expert. Then my sister texted me, saying I was overreacting and my parents were tired from the park. Tired from buying her kid treats, I guess. It hit me they'd never change. They'd keep choosing her family over mine, no matter the cost. I couldn't let that stand anymore. Not after this. I spent the next day after the amusement park incident watching my daughter play quietly at home. She was still shaken, jumping at loud noises, asking if I'd leave her too. That broke me. I couldn't let my parents' neglect slide anymore. They'd left her alone twice now, once at the playground, now at the park, and acted like it was no big deal both times. My sister's kid got cotton candy, ice cream, and all their attention, while mine got abandoned. I called my mom to ask why they forgot her again. She said they didn't mean to, that my niece needed them more because she'd been fussy. My daughter wasn't fussy, so they figured she'd wait. Wait alone for 3 hours in a crowded park. I asked what if she'd been hurt or taken. My mom paused, then said they'd have handled it later. Later. Like she was an afterthought. My dad texted me after, saying I should stop complaining because they're old and can't juggle 2 kids. They juggled fine when it was just my sister's daughter, though. I realized they didn't see my kid as their grandkid, not the way they saw my niece. Years of favoritism flashed back. My sister's wedding funded by them, my small ceremony ignored, her kids' birthdays with big parties, mine with a card if I was lucky. This wasn't just one bad day, it was a lifetime of them picking her over me. I decided then I had to face them. Not over the phone, but in person. They needed to hear how they'd hurt my daughter and me, and I wasn't holding back anymore. I buckled my daughter into her car seat the next afternoon and drove to my parents' house, 30 minutes away. She sat quietly, clutching her stuffed bear, still rattled from the park. I kept the radio off, thinking about what I'd say. I wasn't nervous, just angry. They'd crossed a line, and I couldn't keep pretending it was okay. The road was familiar, same route I'd taken as a kid when they'd dragged me along to my sister's dance recitals while I sat in the back, ignored. Now it was my daughter they'd tossed aside. I pulled into their driveway, saw their car parked, and knew they were home. My niece's bike was out front, meaning my sister had probably been there earlier. Of course she had. They'd never miss a chance to dote on her kid. I carried my daughter inside, her small hand in mine, and found them in the living room. The TV was on, some old sitcom, and they didn't even look up at first. My mom was knitting, my dad reading the paper. The house smelled like cookies they'd baked with my niece yesterday, I bet, while my daughter was still lost. I set my daughter on the couch and stood there, staring at them. They finally noticed me, and my mom asked why I looked upset. I didn't answer yet. I thought about how they'd left her, drove off with my niece, stopped for ice cream, and went home without a care. How they'd done it before at the playground and never apologized. This wasn't a mistake, it was who they were. I took a breath, ready to let it all out. Knowing this would change everything, I stood in my parents' living room, my daughter on the couch, and started talking. I told them they'd abandoned her at the amusement park for 3 hours because my niece wanted cotton candy. I said they'd left her alone at the playground 2 years ago too, and never cared enough to check on her. I pointed out how they'd always picked my sister over me. Her kids got treats and love. Mine got forgotten. My mom put down her knitting, saying I was too sensitive. My dad folded his paper, claiming they didn't mean it, that my daughter was fine now. Fine after crying for hours, lost and scared, while they ate ice cream with my niece. I told them they'd failed her, failed me, and I couldn't trust them anymore. My mom got defensive, saying they'd raised us both, but I reminded her how they'd funded my sister's life while ignoring mine. My dad stood up, yelling that I was ungrateful, that they'd done their best. Their best was leaving my 4-year-old alone in a park. I said they didn't deserve to see her if they'd toss her aside like that. My mom started crying, saying I was cutting them off over one mistake. It wasn't one. It was years of favoritism, and this was the worst. I picked up my daughter, told them I was done, and walked out. They didn't follow. In the car, she asked if they hated her. I said no, they just didn't care enough. Driving home, I felt lighter. I'd finally stood up to them, ended the cycle. They could have my sister's family. I'd protect mine from now on.